Rain pattered against the flashing blue lights as detectives stood by the murky pond in Boca Raton. The sound of crickets faded beneath the hum of whispers and camera shutters. Divers emerged slowly from the dark water, and one of them lifted a black plastic bag onto the muddy bank. A pair of worn car keys dangled from it, rusted, barely legible, yet unmistakable. "Run it again," the lead investigator muttered. "Make sure we have the right name." The forensic tech nodded, typing carefully. A few seconds later, the screen glowed with faded words that hit like thunder. Registered to David Harper, Fort Lauderdale. Missing since 2015. 10 years of silence. 10 years of unanswered prayers. And now the pond had spoken. If you're new to this channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. This is one of Florida's most haunting cold cases. We're uncovering the story behind the man whose remains were just found 10 years after he vanished. Stephen McCrell had always been drawn to water. As a child growing up in South Florida, he'd spent summers at the beach, his mother watching from the shore as he dove fearlessly into the waves. "That boy has no fear," she'd tell her friends, pride and worry mixing in equal measure. By 25, Stephen had transformed that fearlessness into ambition. He worked in downtown Fort Lauderdale, navigating the corporate world with the same confidence he'd once shown in the ocean. He had an apartment, a career trajectory, and a white 2013 Ford Fusion with Florida plates, WJ70L, that he'd saved for months to buy. His parents, Margaret and Robert McCrell, had raised him to be independent, to chase his dreams. They'd done their job well. Perhaps too well, they would later think, when independence became distance and distance became silence. July 2015 was brutally hot, even by Florida standards. The air hung thick and heavy, the kind of weather that made tempers flare and judgment falter. Stephen had been working long hours, his parents noticed during their weekly phone calls. He sounded tired, stressed. "Are you eating enough?" Margaret asked during their last conversation. "Mom, I'm fine," Stephen had laughed. "Stop worrying." Those would be the last words she'd hear him speak. July 30th, 2015, began like any other day. Stephen woke up in his Fort Lauderdale apartment, the morning sun already promising another scorcher. He had plans for the evening. Nothing concrete, but he'd mentioned to a coworker that he might grab drinks downtown after work. Downtown Fort Lauderdale pulsed with its usual energy that Thursday evening. Young professionals spilled out of office buildings, eager to shed the workweek and embrace the weekend that was almost within reach. Stephen was among them, his white Ford Fusion parked in one of the lots he'd used 100 times before. He made his rounds, a drink here, a conversation there. Friends would later tell police that he seemed normal, maybe a bit distracted, but nothing alarming. Nothing that would suggest this was the last time they'd see him alive. Around 9 p.m., Stephen left downtown. Security cameras caught his car heading north on I-95, just another pair of taillights in the river of traffic flowing along Florida's main artery. At 9:47 p.m., his Ford Fusion pulled into a Valero gas station in Pompano Beach, about 15 minutes up the coast from Fort Lauderdale. This was where everything changed. The surveillance footage from the Valero station would be replayed thousands of times over the next decade, by police, by private investigators, by Stephen's parents, and by internet sleuths convinced they could spot the detail everyone else had missed. Stephen pulled up to pump number 4. The video showed him getting out of his car, his movements casual, unhurried. He swiped his credit card, a transaction that would later prove to be his last, and began fueling his vehicle. That's when the other man appeared. The stranger approached from the direction of the convenience store, walking with purpose towards Stephen. The camera angle wasn't perfect, and the man's face was partially obscured by a baseball cap, but his body language was clear, confrontational. The two men spoke, or rather, the stranger spoke while Stephen listened, his posture becoming defensive. Stephen's hands came up, not threatening but placating, as if trying to de-escalate whatever was happening. The conversation lasted approximately 2 minutes and 37 seconds. Investigators would time it down to the second, as if precision could somehow unlock the mystery of what was said. Then Stephen pulled the nozzle from his tank, replaced it on the pump, and got back into his car. The stranger watched him go, standing motionless as the white Ford Fusion pulled out of the gas station and disappeared into the night. The stranger walked back toward the convenience store, purchased a bottle of water, and left in his own vehicle minutes later. Neither man would ever be seen on camera again, at least not in any footage investigators could find. When Stephen didn't show up for work on Friday morning, his supervisor wasn't immediately concerned. Young people called in sick. Life happened. But when Stephen didn't answer his phone all day, and didn't show up on Saturday either, concern began to creep in. His parents called his apartment, no answer. They called his friends, no one had heard from him. By Sunday, Margaret McCrell's mother's intuition was screaming that something was terribly wrong. On Monday, August 3, 2015, Robert and Margaret filed a missing persons report with the Fort Lauderdale Police Department. They brought a recent photo, Stephen smiling at a family barbecue, his whole life ahead of him. The first 48 hours are critical, the detective told them, his face sympathetic. But we're already past that. 4 days had already been lost. The police launched into action. They pinged Stephen's cell phone. The last signal had come from somewhere near Pompano Beach on the night of July 30th. Then nothing. His bank accounts showed no activity after the gas station purchase. His apartment was undisturbed, his belongings untouched, as if he'd simply stepped out for an evening and never returned. Which, of course, was exactly what had happened. Detectives canvassed downtown Fort Lauderdale, interviewing anyone who might have seen Stephen that night. They pulled security footage from every camera they could access, tracking his movements until he left the city. Then they found the Valero footage. Identifying the stranger became the investigation's primary focus. The Fort Lauderdale Police Department released still images from the surveillance video, asking the public for help. Local news stations ran the story, missing man's last known contact. The grainy images of the confrontation played on evening news broadcasts across South Florida. Tips flooded in. Everyone had seen the man. He was a coworker, an ex-boyfriend, a drug dealer, a random crazy person. Each lead had to be tracked down, investigated, ruled out. The detective assigned to Stephen's case, Marcus Rodriguez, worked 18-hour days following threads that led nowhere. The stranger's vehicle was partially visible in the footage, but the license plate was obscured. The make and model were common enough that tracking down every similar vehicle in the Tri-County area would require resources the department simply didn't have for a missing adult with no evidence of foul play. But the confrontation, Margaret McCrell pleaded during one of her many visits to the police station. That man did something to my son. Detective Rodriguez was gentle but honest. Mrs. McCrell, we don't know that. They had a conversation. We don't even know if it was heated. Stephen got back in his car and drove away under his own power. Then where is he? She demanded, her voice breaking. Where is my son? It was the question that haunted everyone involved in the case. The stranger was eventually identified through the footage and interviews, but the identification brought no relief, only more frustration. He was a drifter with a minor criminal record, already gone from Florida by the time police tracked him down in Georgia 3 weeks later. He denied any involvement in Stephen's disappearance. He claimed the conversation was brief and inconsequential. He'd asked Stephen for money, Stephen had said no, and that was it. Nothing more. Without evidence to contradict his story, police had to let him go. Margaret and Robert McCrell refused to accept that their son had simply vanished. They hired a private investigator. They created a Facebook page, Help Find Stephen McCrell, that grew to thousands of followers. They distributed flyers throughout South Florida, Stephen's smiling face appearing on telephone poles, in grocery stores, at bus stops. Missing, Stephen McCrell, 25, last seen July 30th, 2015. White male, 6 feet 0 inches, 180 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes. Last known driving white 2013 Ford Fusion, license plate WJ70L. They searched everywhere logic suggested and some places it didn't. Lakes, canals, parking garages, abandoned buildings. South Florida is a maze of waterways and undeveloped areas where a car could disappear, and they explored every possibility their resources allowed. Psychics called, offering their services. Some were sincere, others were scam artists. Margaret tried not to judge. When your child is missing, you'll listen to anyone who claims to have answers. "He's near water," one psychic said. "I see water all around." In South Florida, that description applied to virtually everywhere. Years passed. The Facebook page was updated less frequently. The news moved on to other tragedies, other mysteries. Stephen's case went cold, joining the thousands of missing persons cases that languish unsolved in filing cabinets and computer databases across the country. But Margaret never stopped looking. Every day, she would wake up and think, today might be the day we find him. And every night, she would go to bed disappointed, only to wake up the next morning and think the same thing again. Robert dealt with the loss differently. He threw himself into work, trying to outrun the grief that was always one step behind him. But at quiet moments, stuck in traffic, waiting for his coffee, lying awake at 3 a.m., the questions would catch up to him. Where was his son? What had happened that night? Why couldn't they find him? Time is cruel to missing persons cases. As months turned into years, Stephen's case file grew thicker with dead-end leads and unfollowed tips, but no closer to resolution. Detective Rodriguez retired in 2018, passing the case to a younger detective who reviewed the file with fresh eyes and found nothing new to pursue. Stephen's apartment lease had long since expired, his belongings packed into boxes in his parents' garage. His job was filled by someone else. His friends moved on with their lives, marriages, children, careers. Life continued for everyone except Stephen, frozen forever at 25, and his parents, frozen in the moment they lost him. Margaret became active in missing persons advocacy groups, finding some solace in helping other families navigate the nightmare she knew too well. She learned the statistics that would haunt her. Hundreds of thousands of missing persons reports filed each year. Tens of thousands still unresolved. Bodies waiting to be found in the most ordinary places. They're hiding in plain sight, a forensic anthropologist told her at one of the conferences. In lakes behind shopping centers, in parking lots, in retention ponds beside highways. Sometimes they're just overlooked. The comment would prove prophetic. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the McCrells barely noticed the lockdowns. Their world had already contracted to the size of their grief years earlier. They marked what would have been Stephen's 30th birthday in quarantine. A small cake with candles they couldn't bring themselves to light. By 2024, it had been 9 years. Some family members gently suggested it might be time to accept that they might never know what happened. Margaret refused to hear it. "He's out there," she insisted. "Somewhere, he's out there, and I won't give up until we bring him home." She was right, though she didn't know it yet. Stephen was out there. He had been all along, less than 10 miles from where he was last seen, resting in darkness beneath the surface of a corporate park retention pond that thousands of people passed every day. Mike Chun had never intended to become a volunteer searcher of missing persons. He'd bought the sonar equipment for his fishing hobby, using it to map lake bottoms and find the best spots for bass. But one day in 2022, while scrolling through Facebook, he saw a post about a missing teenager whose car was believed to have gone into a lake. On a whim, he offered to scan the lake with his equipment. They found the car in 2 hours. That discovery changed Mike's life. He started Sunshine State Sonar, a volunteer search and recovery group dedicated to using sonar technology to find vehicles and the people inside them in Florida's countless bodies of water. The physics were simple, but the execution was challenging. Sonar could penetrate murky water where human eyes couldn't see, mapping the bottom and identifying anomalies that might be submerged vehicles. But Florida had thousands of lakes, ponds, canals, and waterways. Knowing where to look required careful analysis of missing persons cases, understanding the last known locations, and developing theories about where someone might have gone off the road. Mike's team grew. Volunteers with boats, diving certifications, and technical expertise joined the effort. They worked cases that police departments no longer had resources to actively investigate, bringing closure to families who had waited years for answers. In late 2024, Mike's team began reviewing cold cases in the Broward County area. Stephen McCrell's name came up. Last seen at a gas station in Pompano Beach, Mike read aloud to his team. Heading north on I-95, white Ford Fusion, never found. They studied maps of the area, looking at every body of water within a reasonable distance of the gas station. The corporate parks along I-95 near Boca Raton caught their attention. Several had large retention ponds designed to manage stormwater runoff. How many times have these been searched? Mike asked. The answer surprised him. Thoroughly by ground, but never with sonar. On January 9, 2025, Sunshine State Sonar received permission from the Boca Raton Police Services Department and the Fort Lauderdale Police Department to scan several retention ponds in the area. Peninsula Corporate Circle was on their list. The scan of the first 2 ponds revealed nothing but the usual debris, shopping carts, bicycles, construction materials. Mike's team was professional but tired. They'd been on the water since early morning. One more, Mike said as they approached the lake near the 900 block of Peninsula Corporate Circle. Then we call it for the day. It was 7:15 p.m., the January sun already setting. Mike deployed the sonar, watching the screen as it mapped the lake bottom. Office buildings surrounded the water, their windows dark. Everyone had gone home for the day. The sonar swept across the eastern embankment. And there it was. Mike's breath caught. The shape was unmistakable. A sedan, sitting upright on the lake bottom, 23 feet down. We've got a vehicle, he announced, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Somebody call the police. We need divers. The next few hours moved in a blur of activity. Police cars arrived, their lights painting the corporate park in red and blue. Dive teams suited up, their preparations methodical and professional. A small crowd gathered, security guards from nearby buildings, curious onlookers who'd seen the commotion. The dive team descended at 8:45 p.m. When they surfaced, the lead diver swam to the boat and pulled off his mask. His expression was grim. It's a white Ford Fusion, he reported. License plate WJ70L. There are skeletal remains inside. Mike felt his legs weaken. After 9 years of searching, of hoping, of refusing to give up, Stephen McCrell had been found. He thought about the family, about Margaret and Robert McCrell, and how their lives were about to change forever. The not knowing would finally end, but in its place would come a different kind of pain, the certainty of loss, the finality of death. We need to notify the family before this gets out, the detective on scene said, pulling out his phone. But Mike knew that, in the age of social media, they had minutes at best before the news spread. He sent a message to his team's Facebook page, crafting the words carefully. After nearly a decade of searching, we have located Stephen McCrell's vehicle. Our hearts are with the McCrell family during this difficult time. The post would be shared thousands of times within an hour. Margaret McCrell was preparing dinner when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. It was an unknown number, and she was tired of spam calls. But something made her pick up. Mrs. McCrell? This is Detective Sarah Williams from the Fort Lauderdale Police Department. Margaret's heart stopped. After 9 years, she knew what a call from the police meant. She'd imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed in her mind how she would react. But now that it was happening, she found she couldn't breathe. We found Stephen, the detective said gently. His car was located in a retention pond in Boca Raton this evening. I'm so sorry, Mrs. McCrell, but there were remains inside the vehicle. The phone slipped from Margaret's hand. Robert heard it hit the floor and came running from the other room. He found his wife standing frozen, her face white, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. They found him, she whispered. Robert, they found our boy. Robert picked up the phone, listened as the detective repeated the information. His engineering mind needed details, specifics, something concrete to hold onto as his world shattered. Where? He asked. Where was he? A corporate park off I-95 in Boca Raton. Peninsula Corporate Circle. The vehicle was in a retention pond near the office buildings. Robert's mind raced, calculating distances and routes. From the Pompano Beach gas station to Boca Raton. Yes, that made sense if Stephen had continued north on I-95. But how had he ended up in a retention pond? Was it an accident? Margaret asked, taking the phone back. We don't know yet, ma'am. The investigation is ongoing. The medical examiner will need to examine the remains and will be conducting a thorough investigation of the scene. But I wanted you to hear it from us before it hits the news. After they hung up, Margaret and Robert held each other in the kitchen, the dinner forgotten on the stove. 9 years of hoping he was alive, that maybe he'd had a breakdown and started a new life somewhere, that he'd walk through the door one day with an explanation that would make everything make sense. Those hopes died in an instant. Their son was gone, had been gone all along. While they'd been searching, he'd been there, in the water, waiting to be found. At least we can bring him home now, Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. At least we can lay him to rest. Margaret nodded against his chest. The not knowing had been torture, but this knowledge was its own kind of agony. Still, Robert was right. After 9 years, they could finally bring their son home. The recovery operation continued through the night. A specialized team worked to carefully extract the Ford Fusion from the lake bottom, preserving as much evidence as possible. Every detail mattered now: the position of the vehicle, the condition of the interior, any clues that might explain how Stephen McCrell ended up in this pond on the night of July 30th, 2015. The car was finally pulled from the water at 3:30 a.m. on Friday morning. Water streamed from it as the crane lifted it onto the shore, the white paint still visible beneath layers of algae and sediment. Detective Williams supervised the scene, her trained eyes taking in every detail. The car was intact, surprisingly so given nearly a decade underwater. The doors were closed. The windows were up. There were no obvious signs of collision or forced entry. The medical examiner arrived to take custody of the remains. The process was delicate, respectful. Stephen McCrell had been missing for 3,448 days, but he deserved dignity in his recovery. In the following days, investigators worked to piece together what had happened. The car's position in the lake suggested it had entered the water from the western side, near the office complex parking area, but there were no broken guardrails, no tire tracks, no obvious entry point. It's like the car just appeared in the water, one investigator commented. Accident reconstruction specialists examined the area. The retention pond was surrounded by a small grassy embankment, but a car could potentially navigate it, especially in the dark. Had Stephen taken a wrong turn into the office complex? Had he been disoriented, distracted? The confrontation at the gas station loomed large in everyone's minds. Had the stranger followed Stephen? Was this more than an accident? But as the investigation progressed, the evidence pointed toward a tragic accident. Stephen's phone records showed he'd been using his GPS navigation that night, possibly looking for an address or trying to find his way. In 2015, GPS wasn't as reliable as it would later become, and Stephen was in an unfamiliar area, late at night, in the dark. The theory developed: Stephen had taken the wrong exit off I-95, ended up in the corporate complex, gotten disoriented, and in the darkness, drove into the retention pond thinking it was a road or parking area. The car would have sunk quickly, filling with water, giving Stephen little chance to escape. It was a theory supported by the physical evidence but impossible to prove definitively. The truth of Stephen McCrell's final moments died with him in that dark water. The medical examiner confirmed the identification through dental records. The remains were indeed Stephen McCrell. After 9 years, the missing persons case was officially closed. Cause of death: drowning. Manner of death: accident. But the McCrell family wasn't sure they believed it. The confrontation at the gas station, the fact that Stephen was so far from home, the mysterious stranger. It all suggested something more sinister. However, without evidence of foul play, the official conclusion would stand. The funeral was held on a clear January morning, exactly 3,462 days after Stephen McCrell disappeared. The church was packed. Family, friends, co-workers from the job he'd held 9 years ago, members of the missing persons advocacy groups Margaret had joined, and even some of the investigators who'd worked his case over the years. Detective Rodriguez came out of retirement to attend, his eyes wet as he approached the McCrells. "I never stopped thinking about Stephen," he told them. "I'm so sorry we couldn't find him sooner." Margaret hugged him. "You did everything you could. Thank you for never giving up." Mike Chan and his team from Sunshine State Sonar sat near the back, uncomfortable with the attention but present to honor the man they'd found. Margaret sought them out after the service. "You gave us our son back," she said, taking Mike's hands. "We can never repay you for that. We're just glad we could help bring him home," Mike replied. The burial was private, just close family. Stephen was laid to rest in a plot beside the space his parents had already purchased for themselves. "So we'll always be together," Margaret explained. As the casket was lowered into the ground, she placed a hand on it, the closest she'd been to touching her son in 3,462 days. "Rest now, baby," she whispered. "You're home. You're finally home." In the weeks following Stephen's funeral, the story spread across the internet. News articles detailed the volunteer searchers who'd found him, the family who never gave up, and the mysterious circumstances of his disappearance. The corporate park on Peninsula Corporate Circle installed barriers around the retention pond, ensuring no one else could accidentally drive into it. A small memorial appeared near the site, flowers, candles, photos of Stephen, and notes from strangers who'd been moved by his story. Margaret returned to her advocacy work with renewed purpose. She worked with other families, helped coordinate searches, and pushed for better technology and resources for locating missing persons. "Stephen's case taught us that sometimes they're closer than we think," she told a reporter. "Sometimes they're hiding in plain sight, waiting to be found. We need to keep looking. We need to keep hoping." The stranger from the gas station was never charged with any crime. Whatever happened during that 2-minute and 37-second confrontation, it remained a mystery. Some online communities remain convinced he was involved in Stephen's death, but the evidence doesn't support the theory. Sometimes, the hard truth is that there's no villain in the story, no evil plot, no satisfying explanation. Sometimes, tragedy is just a series of wrong turns, bad luck, and terrible timing that collides in the worst possible way. Stephen McCrell was 25 years old when he disappeared on July 30th, 2015. He should have gone on to live a full life. Maybe marriage, children, a career, all the milestones his parents would never get to witness. Instead, his story became a cautionary tale about how quickly life can change, how someone can leave for an evening and never come home, and how the people who love them never stop searching, never stop hoping, and never stop grieving. But it's also a story about the power of persistence, the kindness of strangers, and the small group of volunteers who decided that every missing person deserves to be found. Every family deserves answers, and every person deserves to come home. Stephen McCrell is home now. After 3,462 days beneath the surface, he's finally at rest. The retention pond on Peninsula Corporate Circle looks different now. Barriers line the edges, bright white guardrails impossible to miss even in the darkest night. Warning signs remind drivers to stay clear. Lights illuminate the perimeter after dark. Office workers park nearby every day, walking past the lake to their jobs, most unaware of the tragedy it held for nearly a decade. But sometimes, especially in the early morning when fog rises from the water's surface, you can see flowers near the shore, fresh ones, placed there by Margaret McCrell on her weekly visits. She comes every Wednesday, her day off from the advocacy center she now runs. She brings flowers and sits on a bench that was installed by the property management company, a small plaque reading, "In memory of Stephen McCrell, may all the missing be found." Margaret sits there for an hour, sometimes talking aloud, sometimes sitting in silence, always remembering. She tells Stephen about his nephews and nieces, born after he disappeared. She tells him about the families she's helped, the people who've been found because of the work she's done in his name. She tells him that he's made a difference, even in death, even in the tragedy of his loss. The water is calm today, reflecting the blue Florida sky like a mirror. It's hard to imagine what it hid for so long, the secret it kept while thousands of people passed by, oblivious. But Margaret knows. She'll always know. As she stands to leave, placing one hand over her heart and the other stretched toward the water, she whispers the same words she says every week. "I love you, Stephen. I'll never stop loving you." And I'll never stop making sure that others are found, that other families get the closure we finally have. She walks back to her car, past the office buildings full of people living their ordinary lives, unaware of how fragile those lives can be, how quickly everything can change. The lake is quiet again, its dark secret finally revealed, its burden finally lifted. And somewhere, Margaret likes to think her son is at peace.